Hello, welcome to the meeting. Doesn't look like anyone else is here, but I'm going to create a video stream and put it on the YouTube channel. So if you're viewing this remotely after the fact, we might have some people coming into the meeting later on. But for now, I'm going to go over the agenda items, and we're going to have recording. A couple people told me they couldn't make it in advance, so this will be useful for them. So we're about halfway through the fall, maybe a little bit more than that, and I'd like to cover a few items on the agenda today. So the first is I'd like to tell you about an event that I went to yesterday. It was a local event here in my city. It was run by the University of Illinois Research Park, which is a nice mix of commercialization and science. They collaborate with people on campus, but also have a lot of corporations from off-site, corporations from, multinational corporations to local startups to other types of organizations that want to have a tech footprint. And they do a lot of interesting things. And so yesterday they had a big data summit. They call it the Big Data Summit, and it put some retweets on the Twitter feed of Orthogonal Research and Education Lab. And so that is twitter.com at orthogonal downscore, or I think downspace lab. I don't know how you say that exactly, but let me put that in the window here. So if you go to that link, you'll be able to get to the feed. And then I have some retweets here. So the first one is this kickoff tweet. So this was early in the morning. We had a keynote speaker. This was before the keynote speaker. Here's the turnout. This was held at the iHotel, which is a hotel in Champaign-Urbana. It's a conference center hotel. This is their space. Here they are introducing the keynote speaker, and it's a pretty good time. Here's the University of Illinois Research Park backdrop. So it's proof that they're putting on the event. So they have an agenda here for the Big Data Summit. And they had a lot of interesting speakers. I attended most of the sessions. So this happens every year. This was like the 7th or 8th annual event. We had a keynote here, and Semni Kojeko, who's a professor in computer science at UIUC, and he gave a talk on adaptive and robust machine learning. It was very interesting. He does a lot of work with medical images, and he had a range of projects that he was working on, and he went through those things. And I think we have a retweet of his talk as well. So here we are. Here he is giving a speech. Should we have... okay. Here's Jesse. Hello, Jesse. Hi, how are you? Just starting the meeting. We have a couple people can't make it today, so why don't I start over. I was going to record the session, but I'll start over for you. So, is there anything you wanted to add? Any news or anything? Okay, can't talk much. Well, we'll just go through this meeting agenda, and then I'll put the recording up on YouTube, and then we'll have some, hopefully other people will engage with the content. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was that I attended a local event yesterday. It's called the Big Data Summit. It is put on by the University of Illinois Research Park. So I have it up on the Twitter feed. So the Twitter feed, actually, I think I put it in the chat window. I don't know if you got that. Let me put it back in the chat window since you just joined. And this is, I had some retweets from the event. So they gave there was a keynote speaker here, and he is interested in machine learning models for healthcare. So he's a faculty member in the computer science department, and he gave actually, one of the interesting things they were showing here was that they were able to take X-rays and medical images, and they're able to take the images and create sort of fake images that look like the real images. They call them synthesis. Or we talked about data synthesis and making pseudo data sets earlier in this session, in this DevoWormML series. He talked about doing this to sort of train experts on interpreting images. It was a really interesting approach, and he also had a lot of things to say about different types of model testing and model checking. So that was interesting. They also had a session on advice for professional data scientists to students. So they had a bunch of people from the research park who were, people who work at different companies, startups. This person here, Matt Ahrens, he works at Yahoo, which is a company in the research park. And he had some advice for students starting out in data science. He said, find data and try to do something with it. So I thought that was good advice because, you have oftentimes people want to do something with data. They're interested in data. They don't know how to get started, say, in machine learning. Find data and try to do something with it. So, with DevoWorm, of course, we have our DevoWorm data sets that we use. And that's kind of the idea behind that as well. That we give people an opportunity to have some data sets so that they can work on an analysis they're interested in, or even if it's just like sports data that people want to use for whatever purpose, or something, that's easily accessible. Baseball stats are good. Then they also had a session on mixed, augmented, and virtual realities. So this is close to my heart. I used to work in this area. And they had a bunch of people talk about, VR applications in home healthcare and in design and in video games and education. So there's a lot of stuff going on. The technology is never usually just at the right point to take off, but it's getting better. There are a lot of really good applications and headsets that people can buy, like Oculus and some of these other newer headsets. And then the content is coming to age as well, where we're getting really nice content that people can interact with. So I think that's pretty much it. This is the Big Data Summit agenda for people. If you're watching this video, you won't be able to make the link, but that's the address right there. So check it out. I mean, it was a local event, and I like to showcase that because I like to see what people are doing locally. So, Jesse, if there's an event, and I know you're in Boston, in that area, so if there's something that you attend even online, you might give a little bit of a mention to it. I don't know. I know you, I saw on Twitter that you had watched the Santa Fe Institute talk by Melanie Mitchell last night. That was pretty good. Yeah. So that's probably, that's the sort of thing. Oh, you wanted to say something?
Oh, sorry. What were you going to say?
Oh, nothing. I thought you turned your mic on. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, that event was cool, and I don't know if this quite qualifies what we're talking about, but I'm definitely going to Envision, Princeton Envision 2019. It's in 2 weeks. It's kind of a futurism, technology, ethics conference. There are a lot of really good, interesting people on different parts of AI and biotech and things like that. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'd be happy to talk about that here, or even if there's anything you want me to mention about. I'm going to probably talk about some of what I'm working on there for sure. But anything specific you want me to mention about the lab or DevoWormML, anything like that, I can kind of spread some of the word there too, if there's anything you want me to say.
Oh, so are you giving like a PowerPoint presentation, or are you just talking to people, or what are you doing?
I won't be giving a specific talk per se, but the way the conference is, There are panels and there are workshops and things like that. And there's a lot of this is kind of true probably for most conferences, but especially at Envision, it's what happens outside of the main conference agenda and the people that you meet. Like I met like a lot of potential advisors there, people I wanted to do research with, and a lot of just really good people, kind of specific to my own aims, and people that are much more interdisciplinary, kind of like what I'm interested in here in this lab is.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of just fertile ground there. So yeah.
Okay, well that sounds good. I'll probably send you some information. Like I might send you a couple of slides to sort of summarize, what we were doing, what we've been doing, and what the lab is about, and DevoWorm and all that. So that'd be a good opportunity. Yeah, I would appreciate that. Yeah, because I think people. I mean, this is a pretty online endeavor, so people can participate from anywhere, assuming that it fits into their schedule. So.
Yeah, I think that's very appealing, and the way, like, even like there's, especially in DevoWormML here, I really appreciate the specific machine learning approach to what we're going on and be able to talk about that, and also in orthogonal lab itself. So I'm kind of trying to get one of my friends who's really just starting out in their career but has very similar interests in me. I think they'd appreciate it, so I'm kind of getting them on board in general. So maybe in the next, probably not anytime soon, maybe the next year, they might actually start working or look into working with us here in some form. And I think I know a couple other people that I'm looking forward to kind of talking to about what I'm doing and what's going on in these groups too. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that would be good. We should talk more about that, strategizing, but yeah, I think that would be a good opportunity to talk about that. Definitely. So Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, so that's the Big Data Summit. That was a local event yesterday, and I like the fact that people are putting on talking about using data in different ways, and they have a local data science group that meets not in this conference center, but in the in the research park here. So they always have some interest. A lot of student presentations, some faculty. So you get some interesting people doing different things in different fields. Also, I think they're starting a data science initiative on campus. So there are a lot of people who I think they're trying to find the connections between data science and then everything else on campus. So actually, yesterday they had a talk by one of the people on the football team, and he was talking about how they're using data for analytics to look at how to execute plays and how to what other teams, what plays they're going to run, and they have to examine a lot of game video, and they have to look at sort of quantify the plays and figure out what the probability of certain plays are, and it is really interesting stuff. So, and it's different because it's the way they approach analytics is very sort of seat of the pants. I mean, some areas are like that where you have to get data from in municipal organizations where they don't have a lot of data. They have some data that they collect maybe at stoplights or something, but they don't have good data on things trash pickups and things like that. It's really, they have to kind of figure out ways to measure it, and then they can do the analytics. So that's interesting, So yeah, let's talk about the Envision conference in the coming weeks, or the next 2 weeks, and we'll see, and then you can report back on us how that went. That'll be a good opportunity, I think.
Yeah, and one last thing about local data groups. Actually, a friend of mine and sort of me started our own local, basically a meetup for data and some AI machine learning stuff. And excuse me, I kind of miss part of what you said earlier. I don't know if you presented anything at that, but ours is the one that I mentioned is very small and very local, and I probably could do some kind of a presentation there too. Actually, I've been meaning to for a while with them, but it hasn't worked out the timing. But so I kind of have that could be something else to talk about. Whether for myself or things in the lab to talk about, to show, to present or show there. So
Yeah.
that's another thing just on the top of my mind before I forget. But yeah, that's it. I'm going to kind of be quiet now. So.
Oh, okay, well, that's fine. Yeah, I didn't give a presentation yesterday, but I have this presentation that's coming up here next. So that maybe if I would have given this one, it would have been really interesting. But we'll see. But yeah, thanks, Jesse. Yeah, let's stay in touch on that. And again, like if you want to even talk about your local group and discuss like what you want to talk about locally, we can talk about it. I think it's good to have like local outreach too, as well as like online. So I guess the next thing we'll get to here is I advertised this on Slack, and the game theory and machine learning. So this was from the GANs talk, where we talked about how they're using game theory. They're actually using the Nash Equilibrium as sort of a stand-in for a loss function. So it's like the loss function is very simple. It's like the difference between in GANs, it's like the difference between like the input data and like the adversarial training. With the Nash equilibrium, you have a situation where you have like the classifier and the generator are competing to see which one can outperform the other, and you end up in a place where neither model can sort of maximize their advantage on the other. And I know it seems a little anthropomorphic, but that's the way it's kind of, that's what game theory is, sort of. And we'll see that here in this talk. So game theory and machine learning, we're going to talk about how game theory has been applied to machine learning, some very interesting areas, and then relevance to biological development, which is a bit more speculative. But so I want to go over game theory really quickly for people who might not really understand what game theory is all about. So game theory are it's a series of mathematical models of conflict and cooperation between intelligent decision makers. So game theory really started with a lot of people in like early AI. Von Neumann, I think, was heavily invested in game theory. Morgenstern, a lot of economists around the mid 20th century were interested in and instrumental in formulating game theory. It also comes from like mathematics, so it's very quantitative. It's very sort of economic in its outlook. It's since been like a major part of animal behavior research and other areas like machine learning. But it started in economics, so it uses that language, and it's very anthropomorphic in that sense. A basic unit of analysis in game theory is a payoff matrix. So this is an example of something I call cooperative sedentism. I just made this up just to make this example. So in cooperative sedentism, the idea is all the groups agree not to move, and that leads to a lack of conflict. So if you have a bunch of groups on a landscape, and they all agree not to move around, they won't come into conflict. But if they move around, they start to come in conflict, and the payoff drops. And so the idea here, as you see from the payoff matrix, if this is group A and this is group B, if both group A and group B move, it's a payoff of 0, because you could move to neutral areas. The chances are greater that you'll move to neutral areas. If one person does not move, but the other moves, there's a likelihood that one group will, have an incursion on the other group, and that's a negative payoff of -2. And if neither group decides not to move, that's a payoff of 1. So there's a benefit to not moving. And so, this is an arbitrary payoff structure. The numbers just represent like payoffs that you might give each set of strategies interacting. And so this is one part of the payoff matrix, is that you can change the payoffs so that it reflects, sort of like incentives and disincentives. And so if you move the payoffs around, it actually is a little bit like uh, reinforcement learning, or like some sort of adaptive learning, where you learn from the payoffs. If the penalty is very high, you learn very quickly not to do something. If the penalty is low or non-existent, it takes a long time to learn not to do something or to do something if the payoff is very high. And so, like, if I, like, for example, eat chocolate cake and I, gain a bunch of weight, my chances of eating chocolate cake again might decrease if I don't want to gain weight. If I, don't gain weight when I eat chocolate cake, there's no disincentive to eating chocolate cake. But if my teeth start rotting, then that's a disincentive. That's a very silly example, but that's basically the idea. So there's the incentives and the adaptive nature of it. But why use game theory more generally? And what we're dealing with here is models that have imperfect information. So, if we had perfect information, those incentives and disincentives would work pretty well. They'd be pretty straightforward, but that's not what we have. We have models that have imperfect information. So players have imperfect information about the future. Players have imperfect information about each other. And again, when I say players, I mean like agents or things that are interacting, not necessarily people or animals with like intentionality. It's like, just this is the language that's used. So models deal with interactions between agents or networks in the case of GANs, and they need to generate context given previous interactions. So that's what the payoff structure is all about, is giving that context of interactions. If I do something that's unfavorable, I lose. I have a negative payoff or a neutral payoff. If I do something that's good or optimal, maybe, and it doesn't have to be optimal, but a lot of game theory is oriented that way, I get a payoff, and so forth. So that's the idea there. Uh, and this has been applied across machine learning, mainly to deep learning, in the context of GANs, but also in some of the other areas of deep learning, like, for example, the OpenAI group, I believe, has engaged in some research in no-limit poker. And so playing games like poker and chess have been been staples of game theory research, especially in AI, for years. And they're applying, they're applying game theory models to deep learning approaches as well. And so there's a survey here in this journal, Wire's Data Mining and Knowledge Discovery, a survey of game theoretic approaches for adversarial machine learning. This is actually, I think, the GANs, close to the GANs approach that I mentioned earlier, but it's a survey article which would be useful if you want to get up and running in that area. Also, reinforcement learning has been an area where game theory has been applied for the reasons that I just mentioned, that you can use game theory to manage multi-agent systems. And so that's another thing that's emerging. There isn't a lot of work in reinforcement learning, but it's coming to bear in that area as well. So this is another silly example. This is from the adversarial training area. This is from the GANs talk. This is a slide. And here I'm showing the generator on the left, which are the adversarial examples, and the discriminator on the right, which are the classifier that distinguishes real from fake examples. And so in this case, this isn't a fake horse, but this is like, these are horses, see? And these are horses, but these are like cartoon horses. And these are live horses with like sort of a side view. And this is what we're trying to identify as a horse. We also have like we have a discriminator that distinguishes between cartoon horses and regular horses, but sometimes it's going to get a horse that just is showing its face to the camera, and that's maybe undesirable, but there's a selectivity criterion, and so game theory can help us optimize this set of interactions. And so the generator and the discriminator play a zero-sum non-cooperative game, and that's otherwise known as a minimax game. So the generator is trying to maximize its ability to get its samples recognized as a real horse. All right. And then the discriminator is trying to minimize or maximize the chances of getting real horses, which are over here, but also minimizing its chances of getting false positives, which would be this horse here. And so, it's a cartoon horse, but, and then you can set the game up or the interactions up any way you want. You might be well interested in cartoon horses or the frontal face of a horse, for example. Remember, we're trying to train the model on adversarial examples. So this is an adversarial example where you have a horse face instead of the side of the horse. You still want to recognize it as a horse, or a cartoon horse where the eyes are different from the eyes of a real horse. They're out of proportion, but it's still a horse. And that's the sort of thing we want to train the model on. So we want to play this minimax game where we're minimizing our errors or false positives, and we're maximizing our true positives and maximizing the different instances that are horses, not just like the idealized model. And so this actually is an interesting thing when you compare it with loss functions, because this is good for problems that are non-convex. So convex problems are problems that are, sort of, nicely, normally distributed, where the data is, you have perfect horses like this, and then images like this where it's a nice horse, but it's not like the ideal horse, and you should be able to pick both of those up. And but a non-convex problem would be something where you have like a piece of abstract art where it's hard to know even where to begin in terms of classifying different classes of art. And so it's you have a non-convex problem perhaps where you have multiple averages, multiple peaks in your landscape that you have to optimize for. So it's harder to optimize a non-convex problem. And so in cases like this, game theory can help, because you have these cost functions that oscillate as each player tries to maximize and minimize their costs and benefits. And so you end up with this oscillating function. Now, eventually this oscillating function will settle down, if you hit this, what they call the Nash equilibrium, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But otherwise, there is this oscillation of the cost function. And so in a typical cost function exercise, you would not be able to deal with that. Your model would fail. If you're applying game theory to the problem, however, you can at least model that. And then if you enter this, phase called the Nash equilibrium, or the state of the game, then these oscillations will calm down. So a Nash equilibrium then is defined as gains and losses of utility for one player balanced by losses or gains for another player. So it's a situation where neither player can really benefit from changing their strategy. They have to sort of pursue a strategy. Each player pursues a strategy, and they can't really deviate from that strategy because there's no benefit to it, or there's no cost to it either of being in the strategy that they're in. So they just maintain that strategy again and again and again. Game theory is iterative, of course, and so over a number of iterations, they just keep playing the same strategy. That's called a Nash equilibrium. I know they give an example in the movie A Beautiful Mind, but that's not great. That's not an optimal example. So just if you watch that movie and you see that, keep that in mind. So I gave you another example here. A game called Matching Pennies, and so this is a little bit tricky, but it gives an idea of what we're dealing with. So Matching Pennies is a game where no Nash equilibrium is known to exist. Outcomes are random, but not the payoffs. So the idea is that you're flipping a coin, and you have two players, and their coin flips, and they pick like an outcome. So switching strategies should be common. You basically call it heads or tails, and then you get the payoff for that. but you don't know what's going to come up at the time. So, switching your strategy is going to be quite common because, as we'll see later, it's a stochastic event, so it's hard to predict. And then it's occasionally advantageous for one player over another. And so if you have ever flipped a coin maybe 100 times, you know that you have runs of like heads, runs of tails. So if you pick heads and you say, okay, heads will come up again, it comes up again. This will work for a while, but then tails will come up and it'll destroy your strategy. So there's no what they call pure strategy to this. So this case we have so for this example below, you have two players, brain and mind. That was kind of cheeky, but brain and mind are two players that flip coins, and each reveal either heads or tails. So the coin flip reveals heads or tails. If the coins match, brain wins. If the coins do not match, mind wins. And so in this case, you see that there's a joint payoff here. Brain, if the coins match, if brain's coin hits heads and mind's coin hits heads, then brain wins a point and mind loses a point. But if there's a heterogeneity in the outcomes, one coin hits heads and the other coin hits tails, then mind gains a point and brain loses. So there are two coins in this game, and they're being flipped by each player. And the outcome is that if you have like two heads or two tails, one player wins. And if there's one head, one tails, or one tails, one heads, the other player wins. And you can switch your strategy over time, but of course, the problem is because there's a dual stochastic process there, you don't really gain any advantage. And so in that case, there's no Nash equilibrium because the outcomes, the payoffs are always churning, the outcomes are always churning, and there's no strategy that you can stick with to win, or at least to break even on. So that's the idea behind that. I know that's a little much to sort of digest at once, but the Nash equilibrium versus like something like the matching pennies game, that's basically the idea that we're looking at payoffs over a number of iterations and to see how stable they are. And then we can relate that back to our cost function. And so, people have whole careers on analyzing games. And so you can analyze games for Nash equilibria. Some games are known to have them, some games don't. We don't know. So it's an open field. We don't really know a lot about games. We know something about games. We don't know everything. We create games, but we don't know their outcomes. It's like computer programs sometimes. Generative models generate things. We don't really know what they are. So, in this paper here, Semantics, Representation, and Grammars for Deep Learning, this archives paper link up here, we have a good example of how a Nash equilibrium is achieved in the world of art forgery. So the model for art forgery is this model that's presented in this paper, and they're using it as a way to kind of get at this problem of grammars and representations of language. They use this model where there's a competition between an art forger, which is here, and a museum curator. And the idea is that the art forger is trying to pass off forgeries. Then there's noise in their set here, and then it gets passed on to the curator, who has to make a decision as to whether or not something is a forgery. So it's like maybe like a person who works at a bank is trying to detect counterfeit money. The counterfeiter is always trying to outwit the inspector, and the Treasury is always trying to invent ways to stop forgers from making fake money. And so the same dynamic works there as well. You basically have this generator who's the forger, and they're generating things to give to the curator, who's a classifier, who then has to distinguish between true and fake money, or true and fake art. And so this is the kind of thing that you're dealing with in game theories. You're using these metaphors to get a result that is computationally useful. And so on the right, I have a figure that shows a taxonomy of reinforcement learning models and the application of Nash Equilibria to them. So there's this measure called Nash Equilibrium complexity, and your models are arrayed here in this graph, and they increase by the amount of Nash Equilibrium complexity that they have. And if you want to know more about this blog post here will tell you. But basically, these models are arrayed in terms of their complexity, in terms of the Nash equilibrium. So you have single agent reinforcement learning, that's the least complex, followed by multi-agent reinforcement learning with a small number of agents, and then multi-agent reinforcement learning with infinite agents, which is even more complex. You can see as the number of agents increases, the amount of complexity increases at a logarithmic pace. So, there's a lot, or I should say, the number of agents is, so as you add more agents, the complexity gets exponentially worse. Basically, that's how you interpret this graph, because you're looking at the complexity increasing greatly here, and then even as you add fewer agents as you get up in this area of the graph, so you might have a model out here where it's very complex, and you can't add very many more agents than this sort of small number of agents to have a very complex problem. And so one of the problems then with machine learning, applying game theory to machine learning, is that it's you have to be able to handle complexity, and the game gets very complex very fast. So one other area I'd like to highlight here that's kind of cool and up and coming in applying game theory to games. So not just in machine learning models, but gameplay. So as you may not have heard, a lot of the AI companies, a lot of the machine learning companies are doing work on getting games or algorithms to play games. And they play Atari games like Space Invaders or like Breakout, because the problem space is not very complex relative to something like some of the newer games that exist, but they can train them to play these games pretty quickly. And so here's a Nature paper. It's actually a Nature special issue where they have this cover called Learning Curve. That was the title on the special issue, but it's this paper here, Human Level Control Through Deep Reinforcement Learning. And it was basically where they were trying to get their algorithm to play games. And so in self-play, you have a competition between two models or agents on a range of basic games. So you're playing, one agent is modeling the game, like modeling the game states, and then the other model is playing the game against the AI that's controlling the gameplay. So, in Breakout, you have this algorithm that, puts the bricks in order, and then, controls the ball movement, although I think the ball movement is basic physics. And then the other player is trying to win this game. And so this is an example of how self-play has been applied to video gameplay, and you can actually analyze these using game theory as well, although it's a little bit tricky to do that, to figure out what the states are and what the payoffs are. But one of the lessons that we can learn too is that although it seems like a good idea, there's no clear path to equilibrium in game theory. Like I mentioned, people analyze games, and they've made careers of analyzing games, and it's hard to know. Sometimes it's impossible to reach these states efficiently, and so we need people to analyze the games to figure out what they are and how you get to those states. So it's quite a hard problem in and of itself. So Jesse had a question. Okay, yeah, that came up in the Santa Fe Michelle Mitchell talk last night. Yep. Yeah, Melanie Mitchell. This has been a thing that this is actually kind of almost a staple of reinforcement learning and machine learning research now, as getting machines to play video games. And then, this is like used as a benchmark often to see what the performance of an algorithm is, but you can set these games up in different ways. And so I think the lesson, though, for game theory is that maybe it's too seductive, but it's very hard to actually understand what the game is and how to analyze it and what the outcomes are. So why don't I switch gears for the second part of this and apply game theory to biological development. So this is a little bit more speculative. One of the first things I'd like to point out is there's something called a game against nature. So games against nature are actually similar to the example I gave from video games and self-play, in that you have a single rational player which plays a pure mixed strategy against nature. So you have a single rational player, and they're trying to figuring out what strategy to use. The other player is nature, which is generating states. It can be random, they can be mixed, and then so in this example, it's whether or not to carry an umbrella over the course of a week. And you can see here that we have a weather forecast. And the weather forecast is imperfect, but it's pretty good. And let's suppose that the person doesn't watch the news, they don't pay attention to the weather forecast. They just say, well, should I take an umbrella or not? So the forecast is imperfect information, but you can use it to deploy a strategy. But let's say that the person doesn't really pay much attention to the weather forecast. They may be aware it's going to rain, it may not. They might look up in the sky and see it's sunny in the morning, but then it rains in the afternoon, and if they don't have an umbrella, they're in trouble. So, the observer makes a strategy, and then they get a payoff. So this is the weather forecast. Let's assume this is the actual outcome. So over the course of a week, the person decides to take an umbrella or not, and then over the course of a week, it rains or not. So on Saturday, they decide to take an umbrella and it's sunny. Well, you have an umbrella, but let's say there's no payoff for that because you don't need to deploy the umbrella. Sunday, they don't take an umbrella and it's sunny. They've won, so they win a nominal payoff. Let's say it's like you don't want to carry an umbrella around. That's the payoff. You get a 1. Then Monday, though, they don't carry an umbrella and it rains. So now they're wet and they're angry, but they've also gotten a negative payoff. So Tuesday, they learn their lesson and they start to carry their umbrella again and it rains. Lo and behold, so now they get a point because they are protected from the rain. Wednesday, they do the same thing and they get another positive payoff, or positive reinforcement, we could even say. Thursday, they carry an umbrella. It doesn't rain. No payoff. Friday, they don't carry an umbrella. It doesn't rain. They get a payoff, and so forth. And as you can see, you can learn patterns in here. If you know it's going to be, like if you live in Las Vegas where it doesn't rain that much, you might not carry your umbrella most of the time. So it might not be very costly not to even own an umbrella. If you're in Seattle, you might want to carry your umbrella every day, and that would be a pretty decent strategy. So that's how that works. And games against nature are interesting because the nature part of this can be anything. It doesn't have to be a weather forecast. It could be biological development. It could be biological processes. And the payoff is basically like, say, if a gene is expressed, or if an organism decides to, deploy a certain behavioral strategy. And so these are things that are pretty relevant, I think, to a wide range of biological problems. This is an example from a paper in Scientific Reports. This is kind of laying out games against nature versus games against others. So like in games against nature, like a lottery, you have a certain payoff structure. And then games against others, which would be like where you're competing against other rational players that deploy strategies. There's a different structure to it. So, yeah, there's a distinction between games against non-random opponents that have some sort of sentient strategy for arriving at outcomes, and a stochastic process like a lottery or the weather system or whatever. In non-random cases, you can play strategies optimally, but sometimes the non-optimal strategies, result. But in the stochastic process, a win will occur at a given probability or likelihood. So this is like the model of Polya's urn, which is something they use in Bayesian statistics, where you have an urn and you reach in and you pull out a ball of a certain color, and then you can either sample with replacement or sample again and pull out another ball, and there's a certain likelihood to that outcome. And so that's the kind of thing you get with games against nature that you don't get with conventional games that I showed you before. Another really interesting area, and this has some biological relevance, as you see here, are mean field games. And so this is a newer area of game theory. This is the study of differential games with large populations of rational players. So if you're familiar with emergent systems like swarming and flocking of organisms, we talked about this in our other group recently with swarming and flocking and emergent behavior. This is a model that kind of gets at that area of complexity. And so the goal is to understand the Nash equilibrium states of these type of systems. So like I said, Nash equilibria, determining what those are is actually very hard. But, we build models to see, how agents are deploying strategies, and that helps us to understand that. I have this link here. This is a series of innovations that are influencing reinforcement learning. So this is an article in Towards Data Science, and this is where this figure comes from. And this shows you kind of the shorthand for mean field games. You have different different populations of fish defined by a different color. So you have a bunch of agents. They're different colors, and each color reacts to certain other neighbor colors. So like in the example of Boyd's, which we talked about in another group, this was an example where you have a bunch of agents that behave like flocks of birds. So each Boyd has a rule set, and the rule set is to interact with its neighbors in a certain set of ways. In mean field games, you react to certain things, or you move according to a mass of your neighbors. So like depending on the type of model you use, in a Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman model, you have different type morphs of fish reacting to other morphs. So like this light blue will react to all these 5 different morphs. And you can refine those rules. Say like the dark blue fish will only react to what the other dark blue fish and light blue fish do. The green fishes will react to what the green fish do, and this teal fish will react to what everyone is doing. So you can get a lot of structure in your interactions that way. With the Fokker-Planck-Kolmogorov model, it's a little bit different. It's more of a mass action model, and so you can play with these mean field games and get some interesting results. The math is a bit tricky to understand, but there are a couple of articles on the right here. This mean field type games and engineering article in the archive, and then mean field type games in mathematics, which is this mathematics article. They should give you a sense of how this is being approached. A lot of work being done in engineering, a lot of work being done in mathematics on this, but not too much in biology. But it is relevant to biology. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm not going to get too much into this, about some of the stuff that I've been doing with first mover games and Stackleberg competition. So this is an area, this is something that comes out of organizational business type economics, those areas of research. And the idea here is that they're developing this for a market where there are multiple competing firms. So this is a little bit different than biology, but bear with me, this will come back to biology. So the idea of a Stackleberg competition is where you have a number of firms, they enter a marketplace in a particular order, and it determines their market share. So like, you might think of the PC market, like personal computer market, where you had some early innovators, and they would enter the market with a product, and then you'd have people would follow in. They could maybe undercut them on price, or you'd have people coming up with unique innovations that would, give them some market share. The idea here is that you have one firm that enters the market, they're the leader, and then other firms follow into the market and they're the followers. And everyone knows what everyone else's position is in the market. And this can determine their market share. But what happens in markets in this example below is that sometimes leaders can become followers and vice versa. So in this example, let's suppose that firm A develops the first embryogenesis simulator. In this case, firm A is a leader and has an advantage in that market. Then firm B will make its own version of this embryogenesis simulator and enter the market 2 years later. They're a follower. They might maybe make a version that's cheaper or, has different features, but they don't have the advantage that the first firm did. But then let's suppose that firm B then introduces a new version, but with a key innovation. Let's say you can rotate the embryo instead of just viewing it head on or by its side. Because this is so desirable in the market, they become the new leader of the market. And firm A becomes the follower, trying to match that innovation. Something happened like that with respect to urban simulators. So SimCity entered the market early. They were sort of the innovators, and it was always considered the standard. And then SimCity had an issue a couple of years, like 5 years ago or so, where they had a catastrophe with their, they went online and like they wanted to do like, models that worked online. It was something to do with their digital rights management. And basically it was a, catastrophe for releasing like their 5th version or something. So there were other groups that were also doing urban simulations who kind of stepped up and, took some market share from them and became more prominent. And now they're known, these followers are now known as like the alternative to SimCity, because, SimCity had that stumble. So that's the way that this works in markets. But it's also somewhat relevant to biology. And what we're dealing with in a Stackleberg game or Stackleberg competition or first mover dynamics, it's all the same type of thing, is something as simple as tic-tac-toe. So tic-tac-toe is an example of first mover dynamics. You get this, what they call a Stackleberg equilibrium, when both players are optimal in their moves. So as you can see from tic-tac-toe, you have an X, you put an X somewhere. Then the O is a second mover, and it's usually somewhere else nearby. And then that second player is often making defensive moves against X, because X is like, they maybe start in the center square, then they go to the corner. Then they have like a 2, they have 2 of 3, so you have to block as O. And then like, you have to keep blocking X. But if you do this optimally, no one can win the game. So this decision tree shows this process. So you end up with an equilibrium. So the tic-tac-toe models, one shorthand for the Stackleberg competition, Stackleberg equilibrium, first mover idea. So it's very well rooted in game theory. But this has been applied to embryos. We applied this to embryos in this biosystems paper in 2018. So this is the paper, the cybernetic embryo paper. And so check this out if you want to see this. This is it's not a lot of detail in this paper, but I'm planning to develop this more in another paper. I haven't gotten to it yet. But so in this case, this is the shorthand here. This is the figure. In this case, embryos can be analyzed as a first mover game. So this is a game where you have cells that are differentiating. They're dividing in their lineages. So the first move is to have a single cell divided into 2 cells, 1 and 2. So these are sublineages. And you can see that like there's a little bit of there's no first mover advantage here because it's like you have 1 and 2 that are formed, one slightly larger than 2. But the second move is really where the first mover advantage comes into play. So in the second move, this sublineage 1 divides into 2 cells, and 2 stays equivalent. So sublineage 1 is a first mover advantage on 2, because it's able to establish its divisions in space. And then 2, of course, then follows suit and divides. And then there's another asymmetric division in the 4th move. And so lineage 1 is able to command more area in the embryo. And then, this is a very hypothetical thing right now in this model I'm showing you, but this can, there are ways you can analyze this with trees. So obviously we have lineage trees, but you can also analyze this using a game tree. And so the 5th move, 6th move, 7th move, and 8th move all have corresponding states. And as you can see, 1 is taking its first mover advantage. It's taking advantage of it. So the way I've written this out is that sublineage 1 and 2 are established. 1 has a size position advantage. So this is an initial condition advantage. The second move, which I showed you here, is where sublineage 1 mother divides before 2. That's the advantage goes to sublineage 1, which becomes the leader of this process. Then the third move, sublineage 2, the mother divides, and so sublineage 2 becomes a follower. And then by the 4th move, you have another division event in sublineage 1, an asymmetric division, and that's a further advantage for 1. So you can see how these things compound over time, and how they can actually change if sublineage 2 decided to start dividing and maybe asymmetrically and taking up space. I want to add that there's no agentive thing going on here. Like, there's no consciousness to these sublineages. It's just that they're employing the game in such a way so as we refer to it in that way. So, as I said at the beginning of the talk. So that's the end of that presentation. And I hope that was good, at least the first part, for people to understand how it's used in machine learning. And I just wanted to give some biological examples just to get people's ideas, to stimulate some discussion about that. We can do this offline. I know people will be viewing this video later. So if you're viewing the video later, please leave your comments in the Slack channel or in the YouTube comments channel, or send me an email. Multiple ways to interact. So Jesse, did you have any questions about that or comments? Okay, no, but very interesting stuff. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we'll talk about this later on. I mean, next week I'll do a presentation on. Okay, yeah, thanks for attending. See you maybe offline this week, or on Saturday or next week at this meeting. So have a good week. And okay, and like I said, people are viewing this remotely offline. Let me know if you have any questions. Next week I'll probably talk about reinforcement learning. We'll go through reinforcement learning. We might revisit some of the game theory stuff. We might do a blog post on this if you're interested. And, as we did with the pre-trained models. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a good week. Thank you.